Hi, good evening, and welcome back to Continual. And this is the panel room. And so tonight we're going to be having an enlightening conversation here to talk about disability and ability in our fiction universes, how to do representation. And we want to talk about how, why, and how we see characters and how things have been done well, how things may not have been done so well. Before we dive in, I'm Jim Nettles. And so first of all, I'm going to have my panelists introduce themselves. Lee, let's go to you first.
Hi, I'm Lee Martindale. I write short stories. I edit anthologies. I edited the Such a Pretty Face anthology, also The Ladies of Draytown, and recently put together 28 of my short fiction in a collection called Bard's Road. I'm very pleased to be here.
Always happy to have you. Natania, I'll pick on you next.
Sure, I am Natania Barron, and I'm a fantasy novelist predominantly, but I also write fiction and nonfiction out of genre as well. And I'm very excited to be here as well.
Ian?
Hey, yeah, Ian J. Malone. Thank you guys so much for having me. I am in the sci-fi realm myself. I'm the author of Freebird Rising over in the Four Horsemen universe, also the Mako Saga, and I'm also legally blind. So glad to be here.
Day.
Awesome. Hi, my name is Deena Al-Mohamed. I'm author of The Labyrinth's Archivist and co-author of Baba Ali and the Clockwork Djinn. So in addition to writing, I'm also a filmmaker. My most recent documentary, The Invalid Core, is actually, will be on public television this fall. Super jazzed. And outside of the creative life, actually, I've been a disability policy lobbyist or executive or advisor, goodness, for like almost 20 years now. And I guess for the purposes of this panel and disclosure, I'm blind and have ADHD. Wow, look at that coming out right here all over.
Well, Michelle, now you got to follow up with that.
Hi, I'm Mishell Baker. I'm the author of the Arcadia Project trilogy from Saga Press, which features a protagonist who is a double amputee and has borderline personality disorder. And so, yeah, I can talk a little bit about writing disability from an own voices perspective from BPD, and also writing about disabilities you do not have for the research that I did for studying living with amputations.
So in some of my own writing, I have incorporated everything from PTSD. I have worked with people with a variety of different, both born disabilities as well as things that have been, are the result of injury. And so one of the first things I'd like to start with is let's discuss how these things are used in defining and creating the identity, especially if you're working with it both as characters and also the things that, if you are having particular impairments, how does that come in, reflect, and work on, influence your own work? But, how does it really reflect as the identity of yourself and your characters?
Mm.
Who wants that one first?
And I'll kick it off and then pass it off to those who are more knowledgeable. I've been a paraplegic for 29 years. I've been a disabilities activist for longer than that. My mother was in a wheelchair. Part of my writing is I do have a series of characters, or one particular set that are battle veterans, amputees, various other ongoing injuries. So I can take, I do use my own situation with there. I also talk to people. I think it's the best way in the world to find out what I don't know. So visiting, talking with with friends and their friends and some of their coworkers and that sort of thing. It is not necessary for every character to be disabled. But if you're using a disabled character, for the love of God, get it right.
Yeah, I want to agree with what Lee said about just talking to people. A lot of people come to me and they want to know specifically, how do I research a disability that I don't have? And I feel like a lot of the work just has to be a general part of your life, an openness toward getting to know people who have situations that maybe aren't similar to yours and that you may not be comfortable with naturally. A lot of people who are on the more typical spectrum of ability maybe subconsciously avoid getting close to people who live with disabilities because they're uncomfortable with it. And I think that writing about these kinds of things doesn't work if you only approach it as, I'm going to research it for this specific project, and then in the rest of my life I'm not going to care at all. I think you do have to open yourself generally as a writer to people of all different backgrounds and lifestyles. Speaking to the part of Jim's question about how does the disability define the character or not define the character, I think it's easier to separate things when it's a physical or visible disability, to say, okay, this person is in a wheelchair, uses a wheelchair, or this person uses leg braces, but that's not who they are. It can be more difficult with psychological or intellectual conditions, because in a lot of writing, we want to take someone's diagnosis, a psychological diagnosis, and make that their personality. Like, what is this person like? Oh, they have this. And
Or
I think
they are this.
Right.
exactly, right? And I, as someone who has borderline personality disorder, I have a very different personality from the next 3 people I know who have the same diagnosis. You can have similar symptoms. Disorders can manifest in similar ways. So research is useful, knowing people and the typical ways that these things manifest. But you also have to take into account that each person is a person aside from the disability. Who are they? What is their personality besides that? That can't be who the character is.
Well, and that kind of really goes to the question I really wanted to dive into, is helping define identity. The difference between I am this person versus I am this person who has a condition, or one or more conditions, whatever that may be, whether it's physical, psychological, it's still one of those things of, it's a component of identity. And I think that's the reason that this becomes important to know and understand with the characters we're working with. I don't know, do you want to add anything onto that, Day?
There's so many things. So I think maybe I'll start, I'm going to cheat a little bit, and I'm going to roll back slightly to that first question you asked, which was how much it plays into my writing. And I'm going to go ahead and make an assumption about everybody in the room, which we know is going to be a terrible thing to do. But I would argue that the biggest difference you might see within our writing, which is recognition of a subgroup's existence, right? For years, when we talk about science fiction and fantasy, people have argued it's been very difficult to find characters of color. The same can be said in some respects for disability. And what you see from us is, because of our familiarity with that culture and that community, and the recognition that, hello, this is, people keep saying 1 in 20. I'm like, nope, it's actually 1 in 20. It's 26% now. So it's even higher, because there are a lot of chronic conditions where folks don't even want to call themselves as having a disability. I'm like, oh no, honey, you got diabetes. You got diabetes bad enough it's impacting your legs and your system. Guess what? You have a disability. You have chronic migraines. You've got a disability. So because of that recognition, you'll see hints of it in characters here and there that appear. And so what the difference is, I would argue, is that our worlds, and this is a value statement, but man, I'm going to go ahead and make it. I think our worlds are richer because they are more authentic to the existence of people as they exist. It doesn't matter if you have science fiction, fantasy, and worlds. Nothing is going to cure everything. There's always going to be something that folks that fit outside of what we think of as this little box that's the norm. So, and I forgot what your second question was, because man, I'm going to go right into that too. But I really wanted to get that point in there. And that's part of the reason I think you hear us exhorting other writers to include disability as a part of that, because the idea of we're talking about, it's not about diverse writing, it's about better writing. So
yeah, I would totally agree with that too. I think for me as a writer's identity, my whole young life was really defined by my father's physical disabilities. So he was made crippled by severe rheumatoid arthritis. He's a rare disease that 1 in a million people have. And as a very young child, becoming aware of that and his suffering, and seeing how people looked at him and people related to me and how different I felt from that, but also my mom's neurodivergence and her severe mental challenges. And then I had a son who has autism, and I have the trifecta of generalized anxiety, I have panic disorder, and I have depression, and probably more things, including chronic migraines. So it's different variances. So it definitely, but that awareness, I think it also changes families. It changes your dynamic. You know, I didn't expect to have a child that was as neurodivergent as he is, and raising him in a world that doesn't understand, like you were saying earlier, Michelle, about, you know, the invisible disabilities. How many times people have said to me, well, he's a 14-year-old boy. Well, boys will be boys. All boys are challenging when you're raising them. I'm like, no, not all boys try to run into traffic when they're 6 years old. Not all boys try to do, you know, the kinds of things that you have to live with changes you as a person. And I totally agree, Day. I think that, you know, we adapt to empathy and to reading people we kind of have to, it's sort of sink or swim. You know that your experience is different, and the only way for you to make sense, at least for me, I started writing to process this very strange world around me that I just knew that other people did not think. I couldn't play catch with my dad. He couldn't pick me up. You know, these very like sort of core memories that so many children have were so different for me. And that definitely had a domino effect on how things, and I think it did prepare me for having a child who also fell out of that, because we didn't get a lot of those milestones. You know, he wasn't meeting those expectations. And so you have to pivot. And I think not only do you become more empathetic and your life is richer, but I think you become more resilient as well. And I think that that's what makes us search out for these stories that show people in this sort of kaleidoscope approach.
I actually, if I could, wanted to circle back to something that Lee, I believe it was, said kind of at the outset of the discussion when she was talking about, you know, writing people with disabilities and, you know, for God's sake, get it right. She's exactly right on that, by the way. I think we're very privileged to live in an age when it's really information to do research. If you go online right now, pretty much any institute under the National Institutes of Health umbrella now offers fact sheets on everything you can think of, whether it's mental health conditions from the National Institute of Mental Health, whether it's epigenetics from the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. If you need to get into the nitty gritty of from a research standpoint of anything scientific, there are resources out there available now that really break it down into layperson's terms that someone who doesn't have a PhD can get. And I've found a lot of that stuff to be wicked helpful when it comes to trying to write anything, whether it's, you know, writing a kid who has borderline Tourette's, or whether it's delving into the subject of epigenetics in a sci-fi context. I spend hours on those, and they're awesome because they're like 1, 2 pages, 3 pages tops. They're generally derived from like the latest research, and they're really informative, really fast. So anyway, I know we got a lot of writers who like to watch these panels, and there's a writer track. I hope I'm not jumping the gun there on a pro tip, but from a research standpoint, there's a ton of great resources out there for writers to be able to go jump into on pretty much any topic you can imagine. So,
no, I think that's really helpful, and I think that goes back to part of the question, which is then creating identity, is defining the identity of the character, defining the identity of all the people in that world. In other words, if you write a character, for example, who's visually impaired, you know, what influence does that have on the world around them? We've all seen kind of that, you know, the gag that's used in a lot of things where the glasses fall off and somebody steps on the glasses, so then you have to go on the hunt for the replacement of the glasses. It's something that's been used as a trope, but it's one of those things that when we look at the reality of what a particular impairment is, what does that mean to creating the identity of that person as well as all the others around them? Is this something that makes people more protective of the person? Is this something that, because it shapes the personality of the individual, let's say you have someone who becomes an amputee later in life because of something, does this create bitterness? Does this become anger, hostility? How does that manifest in them and their relationships to everybody else in the world? A lot of us write in that fantasy world where people get hurt, people get injured, people die. There's trauma, there's psychological trauma. When we're going and facing those sorts of things, if we're creating the realistic version of that world and how it would affect people, again, we're back to the identity. How do those events then shape that character, shape that person, as well as everybody else around them?
Oh, I got a fun one for this one. I go, it depends. No, and see, you guys are gonna get a rant from me on this, because I think my favorite pet peeve is when you have somebody who has an acquired disability. And like I said, for disclosure, I actually lost my sight. I was 19, so and so it's an acquired disability. And I'm like, what makes me rave is when the character is nothing but their response to their disability. When it's all about how people react to them. It's all about, and because I was so angry that this happened to me, I became a villain and will decide to destroy the world. Yeah, that would be the Pikachu movie. So, or the Pikachu, the Pokemon movie, whatever. And I was like, or the villain in Wonder Woman. I'm like, of course, she's the villain. She's got a disability. Because I think for a lot of folks, I'm like, yeah, it's a part of me. It shapes who I am, how I think. But I'm like, guess what? I'm a lawyer. I'm a writer. I'm a filmmaker. I'm a freaking fencer. And so when it comes to identity and how I identify myself, man, disability doesn't even make the top 3. So I think when it comes to how people react to you, some of that also is on the character themselves and how the disability plays into their lives. I joke about the fencing, but I have friends, we talk about in the apocalypse, I am the one, they'll be like, yeah, we're gonna hide behind you because you're the one who actually knows how to use swords. And I told Jim, I'm like, I bring this up every time. So yeah, isn't it cute, the little blind girl fences? I'm like, no, the little blind girl is number 6 in the United States.
Yeah, right.
6 in women's veteran foil, 40 and up. That's against people without disabilities. So unless you're 1 through 5, I'm going to kick your ass. So, and I think part of it is I'm like, so disability doesn't seem to, well, actually it does play a big role in my life, but it depends on where they are and how they are and what the situation is, how people are going to react and how big a role it takes. You stick me in the middle of the woods somewhere, I'm going to be in big trouble. That's because I'm a city girl who likes I even do an indoor sport. Come on. But I know there's other folks. I know a blind lady who's completely blind, who's out there doing 5 and 10 miles on weekends, just out there. And I'm like, how do you know where you're going? How do you make sure you're not lost? Oh my God, why do you not die from this? And I have the same ignorance I would assume that somebody who is completely sighted would, but I'm like, but she's doing it. So, okay, I'm going to pause, reel it back, let somebody else go.
What Day was saying about how people react to disability, I think that's important. In your stories, you have your authorial stance, right? You have how you feel about the disability and how it should be treated and how how a person should feel about it, but also understand that everyone in your story is a different person. There are going to be people who react in ignorant ways, and then there are going to be people who then stand up and defend the person, and so I think having a variety of attitudes toward disability within a story that has a disabled character will allow the reader to see that you're not just preaching, you're not just standing up there being, an author sock puppeting everyone, but that the people in your story are all real people, and some of them are going to be wrong about stuff.
Michelle doesn't know this, but that's the part of the reason I keep recommending their books. So just saying.
Well, and I think too that's also the line between identity and community. I think those are two things, and they're two important things. But also what Day was saying as well is that for some people, there is a sense of the disability or their challenges can become an identity. And it's something you can grow into, and it can be something that connects you to other people. And everyone is a process. Everyone is this continual learning to accept. And there are good days and there are bad days. I think the best thing I ever heard that has carried me through a lot of 2020 is that healing is not linear, but like our own progress is not linear either. And as someone who loves data as much as I love art, that was such a relief to be like, okay, it's not one or the other. I can have days where I'm really pissed off that my genetics and my family has made all of us have to take, medicine and deal with this crap. And it's not fair that my son has to deal with the stuff he has to deal with. And we're remote school now. And how is he supposed to get therapy when he's not able to be around people socially? But then tomorrow it's going to be okay. And I think what's so amazing about characters that I feel are the best drawn with various disabilities or who are neurodivergent are those ups and downs, and how their lives and people around them shape the way that they see themselves. Because that's always a thing in flux too. I think it's always amazing when you learn about children who've, were born without a limb or born something different, and it's never occurred to them. They adapt. It's never occurred to them. But then there's other people that, like you said, an acquired disability is a very different story. And for a reader who is abled in every possible way, we have to make those steps. And sometimes it is baby steps, and it can't be just dumping them in the deep water. And that's what make good stories, right? It's the struggle, it's the challenge, and it's the growth, because we're all works in progress.
I kind of actually want to add on to what Natania was just saying there. To me, that's one of the most fun things about writing somebody who has a disability, is being able to demonstrate to the reader that, you know what, you may look at this person and think, wow, that's amazing. They have this disability and they're doing these amazing things. But as someone with a disability, writing a character with a disability, it's the perfect opportunity and the perfect platform to demonstrate that, you know what, to us, this is just how we do life.
Mm-hmm.
You learn to adapt, you learn to, implement your process, like she was just saying, because we all have things that we have to figure out, whether it's how you're going to go to the grocery store to get, your meal plan for the week, or whether it's how you're going to go for your jog down the road. You either want to do it or you don't. And so as people with disabilities, we figure out our way. And it may be a little bit different than the way someone who's non-disabled is going to tackle that task, but we figure it out. And it's very natural for us. And being able to convey that through the lens of a character as a writer is a lot of fun. But as a reader, I always get a kick out of that when I read that in the book and it's done well.
Mm-hmm.
So, go ahead.
Let's just pop in one thing, because I was reminded of something I think it was Michelle said, or it was Natalia. I'm going to seem so bad because somebody said it, but I love the idea. Is because the idea is we don't want to write polemics, right? So the story is not about the disability. The story is about the story, whatever that is. And one of my, actually, I'll even say it, my favorite example of a disability story that you don't even realize it's disability, Finding Nemo. Because Nemo's guy's a little Lucky Finn, right? But it's just not something people even think of. I'm like, the main character, right there, right? Did you not even notice? You didn't, because it's such a well-told story.
Mm-hmm. And that's the thing too, is that disability should not be a plot point, and I think, like you were just saying earlier about, it shouldn't be, your villainy should not be because you are disabled. That's not how people generally function. That's not how we are. But the gradients on that, and it's funny, Ian, you were saying going to the grocery store. Grocery stores trigger terrible panic attacks for me. Some of the worst panic attacks I've ever had have been grocery stores. And I told my therapist this, and she was like, it's super common. I was like, really? Because nobody talks about it. And she said, absolutely. You're in a bright space with bad lighting, with a million decisions to make. You're trying to figure out how much money you're supposed to spend. You're literally working in your lizard brain to provide food for yourself and your family. And there's people everywhere. And then now with now with the difficulties, you're needing to wear face masks on top of that, which trigger more anxiety for people. So little things like that, and talking to people, like Lee was saying at the very beginning, just because that's how I experience panic attacks, which my first one I ever remember happened in a grocery store when I was 8, which I just thought was like, haha, funny, because I like to self-efface, make jokes about myself. When I find out that that's a real thing and that would prevents you from living that degree of normal. But then there's so many other variances all the way through. And that's what makes people connect to characters. It's ordinary experiences that make you question how you go about your everyday. And that's really powerful.
So let's start talking a little bit about story and when we're working with these things in story. And from a world building aspect, one of the things that we look at in different tools, different technologies, different presentations of just the world in general, is we don't see a lot of the time basic safety devices. When you look at Star Wars versus Star Trek, let's just go with two of the basics. Star Trek, you find a lot, it almost looks like the sets were designed by OSHA on speed. However, if you go into the Star Wars universe, you're walking across mile-high bridges that could flicker out of power any minute and drop, a couple of thousand people. Oops. It's a very different form of representation. And I mean, when we look at the world building and the stories we see, whether it's set in the modern era, whether it's set in the future or far in the past, what are some of the elements and things that you think are really important to make sure and incorporated to represent the time and those things that really would also offset that? I mean, one of the things that I've seen a lot of, again, is not seeing things set in the current day or well into the future that represent reasonable levels of safety or things that make sense.
Game of Thrones is not wheelchair accessible.
Yeah, but what do you think he's going to do now that he is, he's on the throne? There's going to be roads everywhere.
Spoilers, God.
I was thinking that myself. I have a running joke that I'm waiting for a hover chair. It'll solve a lot of problems. When I'm writing fantasy, I've got to backtrack and go, okay, how would this person handle that? And unfortunately, my go-to answer, which is Siskowski guys in a sedan chair, is not going to cut it. But a lot of there's artworks that help me out with that. Mostly it's a case of when I'm designing a world, how much can I get by with? What can I change that nobody will actually notice? Particularly when I'm writing fantasy or what I call my trade town scenario, which is basically the back alley outside the spaceport on just about any place. It's poor. It's put together on a daily basis. And the main thing is people find a way to work around it. And finding the workarounds in fiction is a lot more fun than finding them in real life. They're rarely service elevators.
Not too many castles with service elevators.
I keep saying that we're the perfect ones to send into zero G, but castles may not have service elevators, but it is possible to go up steps. It ain't pretty, but we get there. And sometimes that's how you have to write it.
Yes, 100%. And I think this is where, when I was talking about authenticity, right? That's what makes it real. I think sometimes folks keep trying to find a magical or a technological cure-all when they put disability in the past or in the future, because they don't know how to manage it. And so they'll write super senses, or they'll write complete cybernetics, or they'll write wheelchairs that go up steps versus going, you know what? Some jackasses may not have bothered with that. So guess what? You go upstairs, there's the old and the ugly way, and this is the way real people do it. And I think that's, that I think is what sometimes makes stories work well. And that's where basically, read the research, but that's where talking to people about their lived experiences actually makes a difference.
Exactly.
Because the idea of going upstairs, if someone is going to come up with something because they go, well, I don't know how somebody would do that. I'm like, oh, it's done. It was done. It is done even now. And so I think that is where you see some of the things with technology is people, what they think works versus what they don't. I had a lovely chat with some folks who wanted to have a creature or something that would work with a blind character, and said, and it works by having two canes out at one time. And I'm like, all right, as a blind person with a cane, I can tell you now, I'm getting feedback from one. If you give me two, that is too much information, and I have to pay attention to that versus having a conversation with you versus worrying about monsters chasing me. And it only works for chest down, which means I'm going to run head first into a tree branch. So, but they thought they had come up with a solution to address the visual impairment. But I'm like, until they talked to me, where I said, no, this is why that won't work. What they thought theoretically doesn't work in real life. And I think that's where the authenticity of the writing of the stories makes a difference, where you see, okay, how does this work? And some of the things that sometimes now it's not really a clean way around it. So.
And I think that's okay, because stories are about obstacles. Some of them come from outside, people being jerks and not setting up things so that they're accessible to you. Some of them come from inside, even if it's just a matter of your personality hindering you in a certain scene or situation. Writers never shrink away from showing the ugliness of having to deal with, a person's fear of commitment, or their extroversion or their introversion, and how that gets in their way in a scene. But for some reason, when it comes to disability, we feel like, well, we have to clean everything up. We have to make it perfect. We have to make it nice. You don't have to do that. Life isn't always nice and clean and pretty. And it's okay to show people struggling sometimes. I think as long as we're fair and showing that it's as much a problem of the world not being accessible to them, and people not considering them, and then we're not putting all the blame on disability itself.
Good point.
And please don't take your cues from what you see on TV, because that's just, no. If I see one more face feeling with a blind character, and if you write it, I don't know where you are, author out there, I will hunt you down and I will smack you. Well, I'm not going to do violence. I will just speak to you sternly and waggle my finger, because 90% of the people I know are visually impaired. No, I don't want to put my hands all over your greasy face. That's kind of gross. I'm like, oh, did I stick my finger up your nose? I'm so sorry about that. It's just no. Maybe if I've been sleeping with you for a while, then I'm okay with that. But realistically, that's just not something people do. But someone did it years ago in a film, and then other films have gone on and done it over and over and over again. And so now it is this thing where people feel like they have to include a face feeling scene in every movie I've seen about blindness. Sorry. Oh God. It's just, Lee, I'm sure you have stories. I'm sure you have stories as well.
Similar.
Oh man.
They try to help. And by trying to help, let's just say I know how to fall without getting hurt. Martial arts are a wonderful thing. I don't know how to fall with someone throwing me off balance and then hanging on. Both of us are going to get hurt. No doubt about it. So rushing in and grabbing a wheelchair and taking off with it. One, I know where the brakes are. And two, I fence too, and the reflexes are pretty good. But they do that. They want to be helpful. And they write stories where, oh, the poor thing needs help. Yeah. And you can help the most by going 6 feet that way. It may not be pretty me getting where I'm going, but I'll get there if you don't help. That's another reason to talk to someone. You get 5 paraplegics in a room. You're going to have 10 variations on what any day is like. Some days are better than others. Fine. And if you ask them how they handle something, 3 people, same situation, 5 different ways of handling it. Take notes.
Yeah, I think that's where we end up in the most, I think the most difficult spaces in fantasy and some science fiction, which is the disability or, you know, challenges as a mechanism for healing and character growth. And looking at that's where I physically get ill, because that is not how that's not how it works. That's not necessarily even what people want. And it is drawing a very uncomfortable line between what is normal and human and ideal and what is not. And, you know, I think all of us have had enough experiences in this small virtual room to know that there is no line. And like you said, every person, if you said, could I wave this wand right now and change, you know, let you walk again or make you see again, there's completely different answers. And it's not something to be healed, and it's not something that writers, especially writers who do not have these, that's when we get into the own voices conversation, right? I would never ever presume to do something like that in a book. It just does not compute, but we see it all the time. And it's become a trope as well, like, oh, the scales fell from her eyes and all of a sudden she could see and everything was fine and she was loved again. And we see it with body size. Oh, she lost 200 pounds and now all the guys want to sleep with her because she's physically more attractive than she was before. Or with men, you know, male bodies or you know, trans bodies or non-binary bodies fitting a certain mold of what we want to have. And that's the hard part about, you know, physical and even, you know, the more debilitating mental disabilities is that they are more visible. It's people pay more attention and therefore think that it's that they're being valiant somehow in their fiction as writers to be able to, but I'm giving them the ability to see or to hear or to speak. Isn't that magic? But it's, the fact is the matter is that magic isn't real, really. And people are reading this and it's formative for them. Readers will understand. And I've always felt that I personally have a duty to be able to show people things that they don't understand. I didn't know until my 20s that people who were not sighted had varieties of that. I assumed as a young person that just there was nothing. That's, you know, but that's what we learn because it's so easy to see in movies and TV and Helen Keller, right? That's the what everyone thinks, but it's so different. And when you're developing a character, I think you have a lot of responsibility to really think that stuff through.
You know, kind of getting back to the theme of talking to people and listening to their life experiences and letting that kind of, you know, shape your process when you're fleshing out a character. Again, I will sing the praises of the interweb. You know, depending on what you're trying to write, whether it's, you know, let's say it's somebody with autism. Well, there are gobs and gobs of advocacy groups out there whose sole purpose in life is to raise awareness about people with autism. And if you reach out to them as a writer and say, listen, I'm a novelist, here's a project I'm working on, I've got this character, I really want to make sure I've got this right. You know, do you have anyone who could speak with me? 9 times out of 10, there's going to be somebody in that group who wants to talk to you. And that's legitimate first person experience. And, you know, couple that with a few minutes of reading some science and you can write a really, what I would believe to be a really solid character. So Twitter, it's a thing.
Yeah, another fantastic use of technology and the internet, if you are able to brave social media in this day and age, is just start following people on social media who have various kinds of disabilities, even if it's not one you're immediately writing about this second, you know, just hearing the everyday thoughts and streams of people who are living with these disabilities and how often they talk about their disability versus don't, you know, when they're just talking about their breakfast and when they're talking about, you know, having to go to the doctor and deal with medical stuff. And you get, I think, a real good feel for it's about as close as you can get to getting a feel for what it's like to live with a disability without actually living with it yourself, because you're getting sort of a cross section of a person's life who wants to talk about themselves. If somebody is on Twitter just, you know, tweeting their life every day, they like having people hanging out and listening to them, and it's a sort of a casual and non-academic way to just get to know different viewpoints and lifestyles.
A really amazing resource is actually TikTok. So through my children, I have learned this whole world of TikTok, and I have to say, I feel so much hope in the future because younger people, now I'm an elder millennial, so I don't quite count as a younger person anymore, but I am amazed at how transparent and visible and really real the conversations about disability are on TikTok. I mean, you see young women who have craniofacial differences and talking very vividly about how their lives are different in a way that in my day and age, those kids who had severe disabilities of the face, especially since that's such a thing that human beings latch onto, were put in other classrooms, or we all had to have, the more conversations about it, and that doesn't really help kids necessarily. So I do recommend, you don't have to make an account, but just kind of looking at some of the hashtags and mental health awareness as well, the ability to talk about it. If I had words to understand what I was going through for years, my life would have been so different, and the vocabulary is there now. And then same thing with the queer community in ways I'd never quite imagined it would be. So definitely agree, Michelle.
So if we now start taking this forward and looking at how do we use this, how do we use characters with various impediments? How do we incorporate them in a way that just makes part of the world rounder? I mean, because we all know that there's a lot of that movement that says, well, if I include a character and they have X, I now need to also find a way to include X into the storyline. That's not always true. We've all seen the scene on TV and movies or read it in a book where the sidekick's in a wheelchair. Well, then something's going to happen that he's got to deal with the fact of when he doesn't have the wheelchair. We've seen the scenes where someone is blind and you've got to incorporate. How do we make sure that what we're doing is true both to that character, true to the universe, true to the story, and still respectful of our readers, respectful of people?
I think it starts with,
Disability is not a Chekhov gun. There.
I was gonna say, I think it starts with the story. Worry about your story first. If that particular trial for that particular character comes up within the context of writing the story, then write it in. But if you try and shoehorn it in there, most readers are smart enough, they're going to recognize what that is and they're going to check out on your story. It's, at least that's the way I've always kind of experienced it.
Yeah, by the second book, with Millie in it, I was thinking in terms of, here is the story, here is what I want to happen. And I would plot out the story, and then I would get to certain points and go, oh, this could be difficult with her situation. But that's how life works, right? Life is what it is, and then your disability either interacts with it or it doesn't. There are plenty of scenes where Millie's disabilities do not actually interact with the goal of the scene. But I think if you plot out your story first, and you want to know the basic beats of the story and get that outline first, and then you have a character with a disability, they come into the story and they interact with it, and I think it's a little more organic then, because you're going to have situations where the disability does become a plot point in a sense, but you didn't write that scene just to show off the disability, right? The scene is there because it's there, because it needs to be there. And now the disability is either causing a problem or turning the scene in a slightly different direction than it would have otherwise. So it's realistic, and it incorporates that without it being, here's the whole reason this is happening so that I can hammer this home, disabled character,
I'm a firm believer in serving the story. You've got a story to tell. You've got characters that are telling it. If you consciously think, well, I've got to do this to be up to date, trendy, whatever, it's going to stick out like a sore thumb. It is also not going to serve your story at all. You don't always want to include disabled characters, particularly in short, like in a short story. I'm dealing with 2 or 3 characters. If the point of the story is involves one of these characters, and that character is disabled, it's easier to work it right than if it's a case of, well, you've got to have a disabled character. There's an answer to that, and it's not for polite society.
I don't think I would say you have to have a disabled character, but I actually think we've been taught that you have to have a reason historically to add a disability, and I think what that does is it moves us back to that mainstream, straight white, cis sort of a character, and the idea is like, well, if it's a woman, you have to have a reason it's a woman, or a person of color, or you have to have a reason for that disability. But we exist. So actually, I don't think you should have a reason. I think you could just, remember, one in four, you can randomly put someone in there because we do exist. It doesn't have to be the point of the story, because when we start looking for reasons to put them in, then we're falling back into that old ableist idea. And the thing is, there is no neutral in writing, right? When you just go, no, I just want to tell a story, that's not neutral. That's that dominant culture of just the white male lead type characters. And it almost like you have to take an effort. You have to make an effort to add these additional things to make the story be more real to what actually might exist amongst people. So I think I always get so cranky about the fact we've been taught that you have to have a reason for things, and what happens is people then don't include it. And that's why I'm like, I am not your Chekhov gun, because we've been taught that if there is a disability, there must be a reason for it, and that I think is the basic thing that we've been taught that's wrong. That all of this exists because we exist. We should have that in the breadth and the depth of our stories.
When I say someone tells you you have to have a disabled person in the story, you submit a story, the editor comes back and says, you need to have a disabled person. And my usual response is, why? And they come back and say, because you're disabled. And I go, interesting. I think I'm withdrawing the story.
Yeah, forcing someone to be own voices because, this is who you are and therefore you must represent this. No, that's taking away the artistic freedom of someone in a way that I think is just way over the line. Diversity is there not because we have some specific obligation to represent a specific thing, and especially if that's who you are, it has to be in every story. Diversity in characters exists for the same reason diversity in anything else exists in stories. Writers do not push back on your sentences need to be different lengths. They don't push back on you've had 3 scenes that were set in a snowy wilderness. Can we have one indoors? Stories should have diversity in order to feel real, in order to feel rich and deep, and diversity in people is the same thing. If you're not including these kinds of characters ever, there's a problem, because that means that you have one type that you see as neutral, which is not a thing in humanity. And you're defaulting to that and afraid to do anything else. But yeah, just tell someone they have to do one specific thing, especially if that's the author's own identity, that's very, very dangerous and insulting, I think.
Yeah. Oh, I think this falls under, I would smack someone, or no, strenuously worded statement with a waggling finger there.
I'd invite him.
Yeah, we don't want to get into that premeditation thing here.
I think my background is in medieval English and medieval history. That was what I studied before I decided to get out of academia and focus on the things that I could earn more money with. But anyway, long story short, what's really interesting is, my most recent book coming out this year is Arthuriana. And what we hear and what we think is, like you said, the neutral or the normal things. I studied New Historicism, which is really trying to read books and stories within the time period that they were, and using local records and understanding, even the archaeology of the time. And what continually surprises people is how battered and bruised old skeletons are from even the medieval period, where we thought, oh, you just got sick and you died. No, they didn't just get sick and they died. There actually were people that performed surgery, and sometimes they did heal in a very different way, which would have made it difficult for them to walk, but they still lived full lives. And it happened all the time in places where war and sickness were just, pretty much pervasive. So I think we really need to realize, like you said, it's not because it's a plot point or trendy, it's because it's always been here, and it's different in every culture and it's different in every time, but that doesn't change the fact that it simply exists. And you still hear the stories, and you look at the manuscripts and everyone looks quote unquote physically sound, but except when they have swords through their throats, because illuminated manuscripts, people had all kinds of senses of humor, or if you had snail legs, that also works too. But really understanding that is the human condition, that the variety of experiences and how our bodies and our minds react and change to that is part of the human condition. And you never know when that's going to happen. Like I said with my dad, I mean, he was 33 years old and perfectly healthy, and then all of a sudden he has rare diseases that will never be cured, and completely. I remember looking at pictures of him and thinking there was this man before, and then he got sick and he looked completely different afterwards. It's like a different father, a different person. It doesn't mean that he's any less worthy, or that his story is somehow going to only be told by him that was before. It's so much more meaningful, and it honors the experience and the journey of the people as well, to be able to see that whole picture.
Well, so obviously we're going to have to come back and do this again, because we're just getting good into the list of things that I wanted to talk about. But so one of the last things I want to leave people with is, what's the idea though of a character who's either done well or not done well, but we can learn from to represent? I mean, one of the ones that I always look at is when you look at Oracle. When Batgirl was injured, placed in a wheelchair, and became Oracle, she didn't lose that fighting will. She didn't lose her skills. Yes, things changed, and yes, she sort of had to pull back a little bit, but that didn't mean she was ready to shy away from the fight every time. Then we saw that retconned here in recent years, where they sort of just pulled her back into that. That's one of those things that there were issues with how they did put her in the wheelchair and then pull her back out. But I think if you look at a lot of that arc in that period of time, there was a lot of strength in the character that they didn't allow to steal away from her or make her, oh, look at the poor thing, now we've got to put her behind a computer terminal. That was never the story. The strength was still there. The person was still there. The frustration was there that you would feel with that. But at the same time, you didn't lose the fight, you didn't lose the will, and you didn't lose everything else. It was almost, she became more complete after that in certain ways. So what's something you would look at? I mean, because I don't think we're going to find anything that was beautifully done perfectly, and I don't think we're going to look, well, we can find a lot of examples that were horrific. But if you've got an example along those lines that you like, that we can take, people can look at and help use to model for good or for bad, what would that be for you?
I would recommend Elizabeth Moon's The Speed of Dark. The main character is autistic. And it is, she shows many sides of this character, some good, some not so good. But the development is, he felt real. So I'd recommend that one.
So I guess I could go with the obvious from my childhood, which was Geordie LaForge. Probably one of the reasons why I write sci-fi now, just saying. But maybe a little bit more recent example, very recent actually. Edward Norton put out a director streaming movie called Motherless Brooklyn earlier on this year. And it was a pet project that he wanted to do that nobody else wanted to touch, but it was a story he really wanted to tell. And so he called in a bunch of markers with Bruce Willis and a number of other people that you've seen before to tell this story about he's not a gangster. He's more like a kind of a first lieutenant type of character with a mob group in Brooklyn in the 1960s who has Tourette's. So very early on in the story, his best friend in the world, guy who kind of got him into the life, recognized that, okay, this guy is very different, but very smart, quite brilliant, actually. gets killed off the first 5 minutes of the story. And the movie is all about him trying to navigate this world to find out what happened to his friend, while also trying to deal with the fact that personality-wise, he's so starkly different than everybody else around him. Really, really, really captivating story. Really, really good. Edward Norton is typically always good in anything he's in, but he was at his best in this one. So Motherless Brooklyn, you can get it at Redbox. Really good flick.
And so I already mentioned earlier, because I tend to use Michelle's books. So,
Thank you.
because you see a physical disability, but you also almost never, ever see a mental disability. And like you said, the variance of how people respond to it and how the character does it from the inside out is actually really strong. And I also, like I said, have to give my plug for Finding Nemo, but I will give another one, which is Fran Wild's Bone Universe Saga. And I had a lovely chat with her, because we talked about the fact of being able to just slip in little characters with disability. They aren't the main character. They're all these little side characters here and there have different disabilities. And it was just a natural part of that world, because and I love, like Natania said, as a part of living, people are going to acquire disabilities. And that's what happened in that world. And we got to see them as these little bits and characters. And like, and I start counting, like, you've got like 5 or 6, like, you've hidden in this book.
But it's so beautifully done too, and there's so many almost metaphorical extensions of it in the larger themes without giving things away. But yeah, amazing.
Yes. And so it's kind of a fun way to do it, where it's not the main character, but the idea as a part of it in the world. And I will have, I'm going to cheat, and like Jim's going to yell at me, but I'm like, one of the thing is I just wanted to give one little note to tell folks, you are going to, like, please do it, because it is about that authenticity and what is real. Like, we exist, but recognize you are going to get it wrong, and that's okay, right? It makes sense if you learn and you grow from it. So the trick is to learn to fail with grace. And I think that's my advice for anybody writing anything diverse. I'm like, do it, try it, but learn to fail with grace. You know, don't get defensive. Don't just say, you know what, maybe I didn't do my homework right, or I missed this little thing. But you know what? Okay, I'm going to work on this, and my next one will be better. And that's all you need to do.
Yep. I already know stuff I did wrong in my books. They're out there. Just, you move on, you do better. But as far as recommendations, I got to go to the one I always recommend when people ask me. And it's On the Edge of Gone by Corinne Dalvis. It's a YA science fiction novel, and I recommend it not only because it's an Own Voices autistic main character, also just an absolutely gripping book, just a real page turner. It's so entertaining and brilliant, but also I love it because it not only gives you a very well written main character with autism, but also it just examines the whole idea of who is worthy as a human being, because the story is about choosing people to leave Earth and go, do a seed ship or whatever and colonize, and who gets to go and who doesn't. And without being overly preachy, it really makes you think about this whole concept of who is worthy and who isn't. And it's just really well done. I can't recommend it enough.
Going to jump on the ship here, as it were, in terms of neurodivergence, but River Solomon's An Unkindness of Ghosts was probably
very, very good.
Incredible book, and another one of those books that just kind of left me in the corner for a couple of days after I finished it. But their main character exhibits lots of different sort of spectrum kind of things, and I don't think it's actually specifically named in the text, but as a mother of a child on the spectrum and understanding that presentation, which is not the Rain Man presentation, not the, oh, you have such a sweet boy, aren't you so glad that he's going to be a child forever? It's the rage and the obsessions and the difference of just processing the world and the senses around them, and then putting that in a generational ship on top of just the amazing other bits of the book. But I think there's
gender stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. The main character's body is different, and things in space happen with hormones, and it's just really incredible. But at one point, the main character, I think, just says, listen, I'm just different, and you're going to have to accept it. And there's this wonderful moment. And with my son, he's done that before. It's like, I just don't get it, and I'm not going to get it, and you need to accept that. And that's that grace, like you said, as much as we're writers, it's also as human beings, there are places that I will never be able to get. with my son, and I just have to accept that that's how it is. And that is incredibly healing for me, to see those experiences mirror what I have, and to see characters do incredible things. And I know how powerful that will be for him growing up and having that experience too.
Well, I want to thank everybody greatly for coming and spending this time. And again, like I say, I think we'll have to do it again because there's so much we didn't even get a chance to start on. But I do want to ask everybody to let everyone know where we can find you, your books, social, all that kind of good stuff. And we're going to go in the reverse order this time. So, Mishell, you're up.
Well, you can't really find me right now. My books are still available. Borderline, Phantom Pains, Imposter Syndrome are the titles of my books, but I'm actually quite deliberately, because of my own disability, very scarce on social media and stuff right now. So I'm not very reachable. But yeah, those are my books if you want to find them. Mishell Baker, Mishell Baker.
Day.
Sure. So Day Al-Mohamed, have fun trying to spell that. So, but yeah, so DAY ALMOHAMED. I'm actually fairly active on Twitter. If you want to have lots of stuff about disability, way too much politics, and photos of my cats and dogs, that's kind of what you're going to get. My website is the same as my name, DaleMohamed.com, and you can find the Labyrinth's Archivist at like Barnes and Noble and on Amazon. So all the usual book places for that. And I did have to give a shout out. Actually, I really, because I know, Natania, you've written for Falstaff as well. Because when I pitched and I said, I want to write a murder mystery with a blind detective, they said, great, send us a chapter if it looks good, we'll take it. And I'm like, so there was no question or worry about having a blind lead character. And let me just say, that has not been what I've heard has been the case from other folks. So I just wanted to give a little shout out for that. And I do appreciate that.
Ian.
Yeah, so ianjmalone.net is the website. Pretty much everything you need to know about me is there. I'm on Facebook and Twitter at Ian J. Malone. I'm also co-host of a little fun show called the Dudes in Hyperspace Podcast. It's I tell people, if you like college football, whiskey, and Star Wars, then you're probably going to like our show. I got a new book coming out in next month, actually, called Detron City Vice. That's kind of the latest book in a series I write called the Mako Universe. And it's I'm telling people it's Miami Vice in space, complete with the 80s music soundtrack. So which I will release on Spotify later on this month, might add. But yeah, so ianjmalone.net, pretty much everything you need to know about me is right there. Go shoot me an email, find me on social media. We'll talk about whatever you want.
Natania.
Hey, I'm Natania Barron, and I'm also at Natania Barron on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. NataniaBarron.com is my website. My most recent book was a collection of my novellas, which are queer paranormal romance stories set in the early 20th century, where monsters are the heroes and save the world from a bunch of awful people trying to do bad things, but with lots of wit and humor. And my most recent book coming out in December from Vernacular Books is called Queen of None, which is about the quasi-historical Anna Pendragon, who was the early sister of Arthur that disappears in the canon. So there's queer themes as well as kind of quarantine themes, actually, because she doesn't get to leave the castle, but yet has a very interesting story. I also spend a lot of time on Twitter as well as TikTok, where I'm Natania Books, and you'll see lots of pictures of my rage garden, as I call it, this year. I found a hummingbird moth today, so my week is made, and pictures of my dogs as well, and talk of tea. That's kind of what I've been, in addition to rage politics too. So I'm with you.
Yes, yes.
And Lee.
The website is harphaven.net, HARPHAVEN.net, where there are links to my blog. I'm on Facebook, Lee_Harphaven. On Twitter, oh, wait a minute, I'm getting confused. Lee_Harphaven is Twitter. Facebook, Lee Martindale. You'll need to be friended before you see the page, but we can talk. My books can be found at Harphaven Merchanter, harphaven.net has a link to that. Also, Amazon for both print and ebooks of Ladies of Trade Town and Bard's Road. And if otherwise, email me and I'll tell you where to find me.
And I'm Jim Nettles. I've had the pleasure of being your moderator. You can find me at jamespnettles.com. That'll link you to the fiction me as well, which is James P. McDonald. The nonfiction me, which is me, as well as a few other me's in there as well that I don't claim to be me's. You can find me at authoressentials.net, where I'm the founder for that as Author Services and Author Education. And of course, you can find me here at Continual Convention. And I want to thank everybody for coming and joining us. And I want to definitely thank my panelists for a lot of fun. And like I say, we'll have to come do this again. We'll see everybody next time.
Take care.
Thanks for having us. Bye.